I am just delighted to introduce Clara Tuck Meng Soo, who is an absolute icon, hero. I love you. Mwah. Clara is the president of OzPath, an epic GP in Canberra, epic. And she's going to talk to us about the barriers to gender-affirming healthcare for trans people. Please welcome Clara.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today. I acknowledge the traditional guardians of the land I'm talking to you from, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also like to acknowledge the elders of the LGBTQIA community, without whose pioneering work we would not be where we are today. So I'd just like to start by asking, what is gender-affirming care? And the reason why I mention this is because the critics of gender-affirming care all seem to attack us by saying that that's all about somebody walking in a doctor's office saying that they are gender incongruent and us just putting them on hormones or sending them off to surgery. Well, I would argue that gender-affirming care is nothing of the sort. Gender-affirming care is about listening to the person in front of you, understanding them, and then working with them on the path forward that is the best for them and what would actually work well for them. And not everybody who walks in my office ends up going on to medications or going to puberty blockers or having surgery, because for some people, discussing their journey makes them realize that it's not gender affirmation they want. It may be because their sexuality diverse, or there may be other issues that actually need addressing. So as doctors, we're all led to believe that person-centered care is the gold standard of care that we can actually give our patients. And I would argue that that's what gender-affirming care is. That's about providing the best care you can for that person by individualizing that care. Of course, as a doctor, I do make assessments of the person in front of me, especially if there are someone who's below the age of 18. I do actually have to sort of assess their gillic competence. I do have to assess what mental health or psychosocial issues they have, and to see whether there's something that is an area that they need assistance with. But that doesn't mean that I question that person's gender identity. After all, gender identity is not a gender incongruence, I should say, is not a medical illness, nor a mental health problem. It's something about what's inside that person. As a doctor, and I have a person coming to see me to ask for help with gender incongruence, I do have to work with that and understand that. But it doesn't mean that I throw doubt on what they actually see in themselves. I've been a gay man for most of my life, and one of the pleasures of my transition is that I now have a network of women friends who are wonderful people. But that hasn't changed the way I feel, that I still yearn to have a man to hold me. Now, we all know, that conversion therapy, I think it's widely accepted now, that conversion therapy does not work for sexual diversity. So why do we still have doctors and researchers advocating conversion therapy, masquerading as psychotherapy for our gender diverse population? When I was 3 years old, I knew that I liked pretty things and the sort of dresses that princesses wear. Well, I haven't changed, despite having lived most of my life as a man. So why do psychologists think that they can talk to me and change my mind about my gender identity? At the end of the day, gender-affirming care is about human rights. It's about the right of all of us to actually live the life we want and be the person that we want to be. So as I also talked about barriers to gender-affirming care, and number one barrier, we just don't have enough health practitioners working in this area. We don't have formal training for people to work in the medical field in gender affirmation. There's a lot of lack of knowledge, lack of willingness among doctors to actually work in this area, ambivalent attitudes by a lot of my medical colleagues towards the provision of gender-affirming care. So we actually need to have education, training. We need to have changes in legislation that enable doctors to actually work in this area. A large part of gender-affirming care is about the provision of hormones. There's quote-unquote controversies about the use of puberty blockers. A lot of it, I believe, really blown up. I'm very glad to hear that Assistant Minister Khan is actually committed a lot of money towards research, because we still have a lot of lack of information about potential long-term effects on medication we use, lack of information about optimal doses, the fact that a lot of hormone treatment at the moment is off-label. We have a lack of data about the effect on fertility when we use sex hormones. System issues. A lack of a trans-friendly environment in a lot of the spaces that trans people go to for help. Limitations in medical software. We know where people's genders, pronouns, honorifics, sexual preferences are not properly recorded. The question, and obviously, for a community like we have, living with this disadvantage and discrimination, the concern with confidentiality of medical records, and still the lack of universal application of the informed consent model. I'm glad to hear the start of more government funding for the provision of gender-affirming care and gender-affirming services, because we actually have currently a virtually universal lack of government funding for gender-affirming surgery. The cost of gender-affirming surgery puts it out the reach of all but the more economically advantaged members of our population. The cost of access to medical care itself, given the current lack of proper Medicare funding, the lack of a universal standard of surgical readiness, and the insufficient provision of multidisciplinary clinics for children and adolescents. I'm very sad to report that I come from the ACT, and the ACT is one of the few jurisdictions in Australia which still doesn't have a multidisciplinary clinic for children and adolescents. We need more trans-sensitivity training for all our doctors. The question about trans men having pregnancy and babies, and the discrimination and discriminatory language they're actually exposed to. The continued emphasis on gender dysphoria as a gateway to access to treatment. Why do we have to prove ourselves to be ill? Why do we have to make ourselves ill in order to get the treatment that we need? The uncertainty about legal support and protection for the provision of gender-affirming treatment. Now, as the president of OSPATH, I wrote to all the medical defense organizations asking them what their attitude was towards their practitioners providing gender-affirming care. One of the organizations that didn't actually reply to me, of which I'm actually a member, has actually sent me a pre-renewed survey about the I suppose, more sensitive areas I worked in. And one of the things that I listed was actually providing gender-affirming care to people aged between 16 and 18. So transphobia in the medical and research population. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara.
I was actually going to have, with all the slides I had, I was actually have some dog pictures, my dogs, because I think that after a whole morning of listening to really quite traumatizing stuff, it's good to have a circuit breaker, but I was told that wasn't serious enough.
More dog photos.
What I'm going to do, Teddy, is I am what I am. I am my own special creation. So come take a look. Give me the hook or the ovation. It's my world and it's not a world I have to hide in. My world that I want to take a bit of pride in. My life is a sham till I can shout out, I am